Hi, welcome to the Fantasy Review channel. Now, today I'm not going to be doing a review for a single book. What I'm going to be talking about is a range of forgotten authors who are really good in their time and people have sort of forgotten about their work. Um, and these are things, some of these were things that made an impact on me, but others were just massive in their time. And it's sort of surprising that people may not have heard about them quite as much. Some of them people still know, and others have sort of been forgotten, even though they were big back in their era. So the main areas I'm going to talk about is probably books that were big in the, maybe the late 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, but more sort of 80s and 90s, I think. So the first one I want to talk about is Stephen Donaldson. So Stephen Donaldson wrote the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. This was a great series, and at the time it was huge. It was like people were either reading, Lord of the Rings, and then they'd sort of go and read Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. All my friends were reading this, and we all thought it was great. It's a big fantasy trilogy. There was the first Chronicles and the second Chronicles. And it was very different. It wasn't like typical high fantasy. It was fantasy, but it didn't have dwarves and elves in it quite as much. And some of the names were changed, so it was quite different and not following on the same the same lines as Tolkien and maybe the sorts of Shannara and things like that. Now, the first two Chronicles were really big, and everyone liked them. And then he brought out The Mirror of Her Dreams, which was the first book of Mordaunt Sneed. And people didn't like that, and the critics didn't really like it. So sort of the interest in his work died off. But it's a great series. One of the interesting things about it is the main character is really quite flawed. He's got leprosy, so he's stricken by that, and it sort of changes his character. And his ethics and morality is sort of quite odd and maybe a bit dark. So definitely main character is not your typical nice heroic sort of guy, and that does make the series sort of interesting, although that's a reason why a lot of people don't like it. Anyway, that's Chronicles of Thomas Covenant and Stephen Donaldson, who hasn't really written huge things. He has written other things since then. He wrote the third Chronicles in the 2000s, but he's mainly famous for that. Next one I'm going to talk about is David Eddings. So David Eddings, he used to be in the 80s if you walked into a bookstore. His stuff was everywhere. He wrote multiple series, the Belgaria, the Malorian, the Millennium series. Very prolific. He could churn out lots and lots of books. He started off writing, I think, Westerns, and then sort of found that wasn't working too well, and then found that fantasy was big. People sort of say that they're similar. Each of the series is similar. But yeah, they're okay. They're nothing amazing, but they were huge in their time, and a lot of people were buying them, reading them, and some of them are quite good. Next author I'm going to speak about is one of my favourites, Michael Moorcock. He's cool, very cool, sort of eccentric sort of guy. He's in bands, and he's a musician, and he's contributed to music to like very, very famous bands. More of that era. Most famous for This is Count Brass, but he's most famous for Elric of Melbourne. He's also written a series called Hawkmoon and Quorum and lots of other things. Very readable, short and concise, has some really interesting ideas. And some of his earlier works are really short. Like this is 150 pages, Count Brass. So yeah, really, you can get through these really quickly. And he used to write quickly. He wrote he could write like 3 chapters in a night. So he could churn out stuff very big. He's won a Nebula Award for Behold the Man. And mainly big in the 70s through to the 90s. He's written about 100 books, and he started in 1950, and he sold about 20 million books in his career. So he's a big selling fantasy author. Next one I want to talk about is Anne McCaffrey. I think Anne McCaffrey is still pretty well known these days. She wrote the Dragon Riders series as well as other stuff, and the concepts of someone riding along a dragon. That one's Dragon Slider, Harper of Pern, and this one's called Dragon Quest. She's obviously influenced other people in, dragons being included things, and obviously things like Game of Thrones and, Harry Potter. Everyone's riding a dragon these days. So yeah, she was big in the 80s, very well respected, and I think a lot of people have taken notes from her. The next one I want to talk about is Raymond E. Feist. I really like Raymond E. Feist. I should read this again. This is one of the bigger ones. It's like 600 pages. This is The Magician from the Magician series. Huge in the 80s and the 90s. Everyone was sort of reading these. It was a big series, and it was like comparable to Lord of the Rings. People read Lord of the Rings, might read Thomas Covenant, and then they might read this series. He wrote books with, collaborated with Jenny Wirtz quite a lot, and I'm sort of surprised this hasn't been turned into a TV series, because it would make a good one. And he sold 20.75 million books, so he's up there with the most prolific seller of fantasy books as well. Next one I'll talk about is Margaret Weiss. I'm not quite sure how to say her name, but she was huge. You used to walk into a bookstore in the 80s or 90s, and it would just be covered with the Dragonlance series and all these D&D novels. And the Dungeons and Dragons company were making so much money. You can see this one is actually published by them. It's got their symbol on TSR. So they're actually publishing their own books, but then their later ones published by Penguin. They were making more money from publishing their books than they were from the game, and they expanded and put a lot of money into publishing books, but then the demand dropped and it wrecked the company, and they had to sell up to Wizards of the Coast. Anyway, she started off as a Dungeons & Dragons editor and wrote modules and stuff, and then they got the book writing going, and she's continued on writing other stuff, apart from the Twins series, which is probably the best one for Dungeons & Dragons, Dragonlance. She's also written the Dark Sword trilogy and the Deathgate cycle. And she does a lot of collaborations with other people, including Tracy Hickman. And she sold 22 million books, so she's not. She's pretty good as well, like the others. Next one I'll talk about is Jack Vance. He's a really famous US author, writing from the late 40s through to the 2000s. Wrote the Dying Earth series for fantasy. That's the Kugel Saga, one of those. And also the Lioness trilogy. Very prolific. Wrote about 100 books. But mainly probably known for science fiction rather than fantasy. But has won both the Hugo and Nebula Awards. So out of all these authors I've spoken about, he's the one that's won those two awards. The only one that's won both of those. Those being the two big fantasy awards, fantasy and science fiction. Second last, Marion Zimmer Bradley. Quite famous, and I think probably still well known. Initially writing from the 1950s. Famous and noted for pushing a feminist edge in her work, which was great. Known for the Darkover series and the Avalon series. This is Lady of Trillium, one of her collaborations. She wrote probably a famous book is The Mists of Avalon. That was huge in like the 80s and 90s. Everyone was sort of reading that. It's a retelling of the Arthurian cycle, but from the female character's perspective. And yeah, it's a really good read. Unfortunately, her legacy was sort of marred by the fact that it ended up that news got out that she was involved in various criminal activity. Some of it was really dark. So I won't talk about that. But and that might be a reason why she's not so famous these days. Lastly, I want to talk about, on a lighter note, talk about Andre Norton. So when I was growing up, when I was in my teens, Andre Norton books were one of the sort of pulpy science fiction books that are around in the library. You could go and read science fiction and fantasy. Writing from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I'm not sure if she went into the 80s. Generally acknowledged a top-notch author, very famous, contributed widely to the fantasy field, and one of the first big female authors. Her real name's Alice Mary Norton. but she wrote under a pen name Andre Norton because, really ridiculously in that era, male authors sold better than female authors, so that's what she did. That's what she had to do. Very prolific. She wrote about 19 different series. Not 19 books, 19 different series, and in each of those she might have written 3 or 6 books or whatever. Some of the series include the Half-Blood Chronicles, The Witch World, Carol's Rex, Beastmaster, which was made into a movie, another very good one. And she's prolific and a big seller. She sold 90 million copies of her books. Sits at number 11 of the top fantasy bestsellers, straight after George R.R. Martin. So there's a whole bunch of 10 great fantasy authors. A lot of these are forgotten, but were great in their time. I'll put their names down in the field below this on YouTube. And yeah, if you're looking for something to read, some of these people are my favourites. Definitely worth having a look into. Thanks a lot. And this has been the Fantasy Review. Cheers.